And it's BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? You might notice that this episode is coming out a little bit differently than most of the Zodiac Monday episodes. And I had an entire Zodiac Monday planned where I was going to be talking to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, just a podcast version with the images on the screen. But I just decided to check to see if Dale Julin's book, Catching Zodiac, had been released. And indeed it has. I knew that it was going to come out at some time in January of 2024, and I was able to get one off of Amazon.com. I have the electronic Kindle edition. And I'm going to be talking to you guys all about the book Catching Zodiac by Dale Julin, who is affiliated with the Casebreakers. In 2021, the Casebreakers created a media firestorm when they announced to the United States of America and the world that Gary Francis Poste was the Zodiac Killer, the famous Zodiac, the serial killer from the 1960s, and then went on to commit possible crimes in the 1970s. All of that is unconfirmed, and who knows really when the letters stopped. The first Zodiac letter was written and mailed on July 31st of 1969. I had to say written and mailed because we know the mailing dates. We don't necessarily know when the person conceived the idea in his mind. However, let's go beyond just the basic Zodiac events. December 20th, 1968, the Lake Herman Road murders. July 4th, 1969, the Blue Rock Springs shooting. September 27th of 1969, the Lake Berryessa stabbing. And October 11th of 1969 was the Stein murder. And in Dale Julin's book, Catching Zodiac, there is a very brief synopsis of the Zodiac events. And when I was reading that stuff was just an absolute page turner. I was just like, okay, wow, this is actually a pretty good retelling of the story involving the Zodiac murders. Then everything changed once you got into the next chapter because it's now talking about how Dale Julin learned about the suspect Gary Francis Poste. And one thing that Dale Julin wants to be very clear about is he was not the first person to talk about Gary Francis Poste as the Zodiac Killer. He has made original discoveries, possible discoveries in the case, but he learned about this information from somebody named Chris Avery. Beautiful name, right? Avery. And I'm just going to clear that up right now. Chris Avery does not appear to be related to Paul Avery, the reporter who wrote about the Zodiac Killer. But this guy named Chris Avery contacts Dale Julin because Dale Julin works in the media business. He is more or less what we would call a TV host, talk show host. He hosted a morning show, and he would say 5:35 is your sunrise time. He would just say that over and over again. And this guy comes forward and gets in touch with him and says, I know who the Zodiac Killer was. The Zodiac Killer from the 1960s, I know who he is. And I'm going to be clear about one thing during this book discussion. Firstly, this is going to be two parts. As you see, this is part one, and I'm going to try and tell as much of the story as I can without giving everything away. That would be somewhat unfair to Dale Julin, but this is going to come out in two parts, one today and one on Wednesday to anyone who's listening to these things as they come out live. And that will be done as the AMA will be taking a lot more questions and comments from you guys about Gary Poste as a Zodiac suspect. And also, I've been very critical of the Casebreakers in the past. I've been very critical of everything they have said about Gary Francis Poste. But one thing that you guys will remember is I've always said that Dale Julin is a person from the Casebreakers whom I thought was the best at articulating the Zodiac story. And a lot of my disdain for the Casebreakers is focused on a different individual named Tom Colbert, as opposed to Dale Julin himself. If you listen to Dale Julin talk about the Zodiac Killer, he's actually pretty good at telling a lot of the parts of the story, and he's definitely a real researcher. I'm also the host of the Zodiac Killer channel's Interview with the Experts series, and last spring we were talking about bringing that back on the Zodiac Killer channel. As you heard already, 2 episodes have been released. And one person that I proposed interviewing was Dale Julin, because he is a researcher, and Gary Poste is now a widely discussed Zodiac Killer suspect. And before we get into other elements of the story, I just want to say that I'm going to respond to you guys in the chat, but comments that are about Gary Poste as a Zodiac suspect will be given priority. But first, just a couple of quick hellos. Wrathchild is here. Hello, Wrathchild. Cat Daddy Steve. Good morning, Ned. USA time. Good morning to you, too. Andrew WVA says, good morning, guys. Good morning to Andrew in the great state of West Virginia, the Swedish chef. Hello, and good afternoon in Sweden. Mr. JSV is here and says, hi to Cat Daddy Steve. Hi to all you guys. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Okay, so this guy named Dale Julin gets this message about Chris knows who the Zodiac killer is. What pieces of evidence are they going to have to connect the dots? And Dale Julin was not a Zodiac researcher at the time. As I said, he was a TV host. So they plan a meeting. And firstly, they arrange this thing where there's a woman named Jillian who's going to accompany Dale Julin to the meeting with Chris Avery. And it turns out that Chris Avery is actually a homeless man. And I don't know who this woman Jillian was. In one sentence, it says she's the assistant, but I began to formulate that as like personal assistant in my mind. But then in another part of the book, it says that she was the assistant director for the news. So not exactly like a secretary or executive assistant, something like that. But she goes to the meeting with this guy named Chris Avery, who says that he knows who the Zodiac killer was. And I don't know anything about her other than this story, but I like her. She is just filled with natural skepticism and has doubts. And as I said, it turns out that Chris Avery is a homeless person. They plan to meet at a restaurant, and Chris Avery shows up early, and he just orders a bunch of food that he is just eating by himself. He's trying to take advantage of people because they're going to be picking up the bill. He even orders a bottle of red wine and starts trying to drink. And he says, let's have a toast to the celebration and the revelation of this news. And Jillian's the person like, no, absolutely not. We're not here to buy you food and alcohol. And then Chris Avery starts telling the story. I know who the Zodiac was. And they said, well, who's your suspect? No, it's not a suspect. It's the truth. And it turns into a dynamic of this woman, Jillian, just wants to shut everything down. Let's walk away. No, let's not hear him out. He's wasting our time. How do we know that he has actually found the Zodiac killer? Now, Dale Julin is going to do what a lot of us do, and that is sit back and just think, okay, I want to at least hear the guy out. And it turned out that Gary Poste was somebody who was somewhat of a mentor to Chris Avery. He preferred to be called the old man. Gary Poste did. And he would go on these types of hunting trips in the mountains. And one thing that Chris Avery shared that really bothered him about Gary Poste was that he would torture animals. The hunting trips were not done for anything other than killing the animals. He said very clearly that he would shoot the animals and he would cut their bodies open, but he wouldn't even eat the meat. And he would put stuff in the trees and like tie hooks around them so that bears would come up there, and then they would bite into whatever type of bait that was used, and the bears would just kind of get a hook stuck in their mouth. It was done purely to either kill the animals or torture the animals. And Chris went on to say that it was some very disturbing stuff. But he's saying this in a very rough and abrasive way. And they're in this meeting, and which is just at a restaurant. And Dale Julin wants to, hear more about this. He's like, what's the name of your suspect? And everybody already knows, right? Gary Francis Poste. Now, Dale Julin was not somebody who was an extreme Zodiac buff at the time. So what he decided to do was just kind of what we all do at a certain point, just get on zodiackiller.com and read through the information. And one of the things that Dale Julin said in the book was that he just wanted to see a list of the letters that were written by the Zodiac killer, because Dale Julin grew up in California. He knew who the Zodiac was in terms of being reported in the media. He had heard about the Zodiac as a kid, so he was aware that the Zodiac was a serial killer who wrote letters and created cryptograms and greeting cards. So the way that Dale tells the story is he's just reading the list of communications that were written by the Zodiac killer, and one of them was the Halloween card that was mailed on October 27th of 1970 to Paul Avery, not Chris Avery, but Paul Avery, the reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle. Now, they tried to look into any type of possible family connection between Chris Avery and Paul Avery. They said there is none. Chris Avery also says that he is not a relative of Paul Avery. It's just the same name. I mean, the name Avery comes up from time to time. All right, so they have the Halloween card. The Halloween card has two skeletons on it. It has pumpkins. It has the word boo in the middle, and some very odd uses of numbers. Like, for example, there's a skeleton that has the number 14, but the number 4 is written out as a number, and then the word teen is next to it. 14, T-E-E-N. Did I get it right? T-E-E-N. I think I said 3 E's the first time, excuse me. Now, that's something that Dale thought was very weird. But on the Halloween card, in one part of it, there are the words, by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire, slaves, paradise. I'll say it again. By rope, by knife, by gun, by fire, slaves, paradise. And the slaves and paradise intersect on the letter A, actually. So Dale Julin now had been presented with this name, Gary Francis Poste, and he was just looking at that section there, by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire, and he began to notice that, okay, I can see the G. Yeah, you just saw the G, by gun, right? That's the first letter in the word gun, G, like Gary. And there's an A and an R and a Y. And then there's a P, an O, and an S. And there's an E. And there are all of these letters that would be found in Gary Poste's name. But then he's like, there's also the full name Francis. And there's the full name Gary. The only thing that is missing is the letter T. But remember what I said, 14, 4, where teen is written out, T-E-E-N. And I thought that Dale Julin was going to say you're supposed to take that letter from teen and move it over to the by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire. But what he actually says is you're supposed to look for the letter T, and the intersection, as I make this shape right now, you'll see that a cross resembles the letter T. Slaves in paradise intersect on the Halloween card using the letter A, but that makes the shape of a T, meaning all of the letters in Gary Francis Poste are found in that message. But when you guys hear me out on that, Dale Julin made another observation, and this is more important. Firstly, hi Jerome, the French Wrecking Crew. This is more important. By rope, by knife, by gun, by fire, slaves, paradise. How many letters is that? Bear in mind that the A is only used once. How many letters is that? 37. And in 1974, the Zodiac would send the Exorcist letter, which claimed that he killed 37 people. Those words on the Halloween card total up to 37 letters. I don't know if Dale Julin was the first person to do that. As I said, he's worked on this book for years, but that is something that he shared, which I think is more valuable than just looking at saying, okay, well, here's a G and here's an A and an R and a Y at a random piece of text and saying that he has found the name Gary Francis Poste. And guess what? In the book, he tells that story 3 times already. As I said, this is just part 1 of the book discussion. He tells that story 3 times. This is how he introduces his suspect to people. He's like, all right, I want you to find the G. Is there an A? Is there an R? Is there a Y in this text? By rope, by knife, by gun, by fire, slaves, paradise. And it just goes on that over and over. And I don't do traditional book reviews here on this channel, but that got a little bit redundant. Is that a beneficial way? Is that a practical method to try and solve the case? Absolutely not. I'm going to be very direct. That is not practical for the following reason. I have never liked these types of observations. And the reason why is that it's twofold. Number one, he doesn't necessarily have certainty that that's what the Zodiac was trying to do. It's just more or less what we would call an educated guess. Secondarily, he's cherry picking to get a desired result. And he admits this in the book. He's like, okay, what other people don't know is the name. I know what name to look for. Now I can find Gary Poste and the Zodiac's communications because he knows the name already. That's the definition of cherry picking to get a desired result. Then you might have noticed something. I'm going to say those words again because Dale Julin says it in the book 3 times. By rope, by knife, by gun, by fire, slaves, paradise. And you pull out certain letters to spell Gary Francis Poste, right? But he doesn't use all of the letters. He doesn't use all of the letters that are available there. For example, the word gun begins with G, like Gary, but the letter U is not used in any type of solution. It has no value to this method that Dale Julin is trying to employ. So I don't think very highly of that. And the reason why is because I was very critical of a different Zodiac killer researcher named Thomas Henry Horan, who had a comment about the Zodiac killer's first cipher, the 408. And the final line of the 408 cipher is called the Z18 code. And it's more or less gibberish, but what Thomas Horan said is that there are misspellings in the 408 cipher, and what you need to do is you need to drag down the misspelled letter, and you can substitute it into the Z18 to get the correct spelling. For example, the word dangerous is spelled Dangeroue. You bring the E down, and you can substitute the letter E for S in the Z18 code, and that's how you solve it. So I think that is just also impractical, because what I said about him was he doesn't use all of the letters in his method to try and solve the Z18. For example, there's the word slow spelled SLOI, and I and W are not used at all in his solution. It doesn't go all the way. And if I'm going to be critical of him for that, I have to be critical of Dale Julin for doing the exact same thing. So they have this first meeting with this guy named Chris Avery, who says that he's solved the Zodiac killer mystery. He knows who the Zodiac was. And then Dale Julin begins to mess around with the Zodiac communications, particularly the Halloween card. But then the 340. He claims that he has also found Gary Francis Post's name in the 340. The 340 was solved in the winter of 2020 by David Ornchak, Earl Van Eyck, and Sam Blake. But the method that is used for Dale Julin has nothing to do with the solution to the 340. It's just about looking at the symbols. And when you look at the symbols, you'll see at the bottom of the 340 text, there are some English letters that are used as symbols: P, O, S, H, and T. And what this is, in Dale Julin's mind, is the name Post. And Jillian comes back into the picture again. I don't know who Jillian is, but I like her. And she says, now, wait a second. Doesn't say Post. Dale Julin even talks to people at an FBI office, and they were like, now, wait a second. That doesn't say Post. It says P-O-S-H-T. And he's like, well, it could be Gary Post, but he's just disguising it a little bit so he doesn't get caught or something like that, or it's something that's supposed to lead you in that direction of being the name Post. There are a couple possibilities, P-O-S-H and T. You can even just focus on P-O-S-H. Some people think it's the word posh, but some of you guys out there who are ex-Navy have told me that that means port, out, starboard, home, right? That is another naval term. Countless clues would suggest that the Zodiac killer was in the Navy. Gary Post was in the Air Force, though, so, I mean, Navy, Air Force, some type of military connection. There are just countless clues that suggest that. I'm also not really impressed by looking at the letters in the cipher, P-O-S-H-T, and you think that's the solution, that that's the killer's identity, and that reveals Gary Post. But there's another individual that is following the developments of Dale Julin's research, and his name is Lawton Dodd. And again, I know nothing about Mr. Dodd other than what's in the book Catching Zodiac by Dale Julin. And firstly, Dale Julin makes this discovery about the pulling the letters Gary Francis Post out of the Halloween card, and Mr. Dodd says, now wait a second, Dale. You don't know who this Chris Avery guy is. He's a literal homeless person who says that he used to go hunting with Gary Post, and that Gary Post was some type of mentor in his life or something, but the guy is homeless now, and he might have even have tried to cheat you out of lunch one day and just to get you to buy him a bunch of food. How can you just attach yourself to this wild story? How can you just go along with somebody's wild story without verifying it? I don't know Mr. Dodd either, but I like him. I like the natural skepticism. But we've talked about a few pieces of evidence, messages that are found in the communication. Here's something that's a little bit bigger, and that is something that comes from Chris Avery. He claims that Gary Francis Post confessed to him that he was the Zodiac killer. That's why he's saying this is not a suspect. This guy was the Zodiac. Now, you might be wondering, are there any kind of circumstances around this confession? As I'm just reading this book, what I have found is that there is almost a contradiction, not quite a contradiction, because that's not fair. It's just that the first time that Gary Post talks about the Zodiac is with Chris Avery, and Chris Avery makes a comment about the Zodiac killer, and Gary Post's response in Avery's story is, who is the Zodiac killer? He asked that as a question, not immediately saying anything to show that he actually remembers the Zodiac case. Now, grew up in California during the 60s and 70s. I mean, he was an adult male then, early 30s. Okay, sure. But he doesn't show anything that suggests that he's even familiar with the story at all. Then apparently later on, Chris Avery heard this confession from Gary Post that he was the Zodiac. And we're going to talk a lot more about the evidence, but first, I just want to remind you guys that if you want to follow along with this book discussion on Catching Zodiac by Dale Julin, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And you can tune in on the Wednesday show. And if there are any ideas that you have for future episodes of Black Box Online Radio, please put them in the comment section down below. And if you have something larger, you can send it to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And at this time, I would like to get to your supporter shout-outs. Anybody who makes a donation or contribution to help the show will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. You can use the super thanks on YouTube or go to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. And our first one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery. Thank you for your regular and consistent support. You're amazing. And the second one comes to us from Batman66. You two guys are awesome. I cannot tell you that enough. And once again, anyone can use buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. Now, I'm going to get to the chat before I go on with some of the evidence that is provided. And we have Cat Daddy Steve saying 37, gotcha. Now, the Zodiac seems to have this connection to the number 37. Some people believe that the Exorcist letter was the final Zodiac letter, and the number 37 could be important. I'm not even able to tell you the exact truth of this observation that there are 37 letters in the by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire. Well, let's just call it the Wheel of Death because it's easier to say and I don't have to go through the whole thing. There are 37 letters in this Wheel of Death. Note that the Zodiac is written on the Halloween card. Then the Zodiac claims 37 murders. Is there something there? I mean, I just have to ask it as a question. But in the entire book, out of everything that I've read so far, that stands out to me as the strongest piece of information and the strongest contribution in the story. The Swedish chef says, you can spell out Ronald Reagan too from those letters. It's nonsense. Well, that's just it, the Swedish chef. That's just it. You can make multiple names. And people are telling Dale Julin this. I'm so surprised that he's just writing this out in the book. And they're like, now, wait a second. How exactly do you know that you're pulling out the right letters? And he just says, I know the name to search for, and all of it seems to be working out. David Lindsay says, exactly why it's so vital to this community. And do you mean the Swedish chef? Perhaps, yes, he's very vital. And Jean Gier, or maybe it's Jeannie Gier. Good afternoon, Ed from Germany. Nice to see you too. And Cat Daddy Steve says he wants a future episode on the Las Vegas Massacre, perhaps. Hey, River Prawn Pottery is here, yes. And he says, welcome. Well, I can't say thank you enough. Now, I told you guys that there were going to be some pieces of evidence that I wanted to discuss with you. And that is, a lot of it is the profile that has been created by Chris Avery when he's making notes about Gary Francis Post being the Zodiac killer. Now, again, story from Chris Avery. Gary Post kept a journal, and he wrote in his journal every day, and Chris Avery remembers frequently seeing the Zodiac symbol in that journal, the circle with the cross going through it. That's one. Number two, I said there would be a profile. Gary Post was 6 feet tall, and in his later years, he was about 175, 180 pounds, and then he went on to, well, it's actually beforehand. He was heavier before. He lost a lot of weight the older that he got. And also, this is a very bizarre part of the book. What was Gary Post's shoe size? Around 10. That's what it says. Around 10. Almost, like around, almost. I mean, What exactly does that mean? Around 10, the same shoe size as the Zodiac Killer, the same one from the footprints at Lake Berryessa, so Dale Julin wrote in the book. Now, the Zodiac at Lake Berryessa wore 10 and a halves. They had the Wingwalker shoes. They found the footprints of the Zodiac. He wore 10 and a halves. Is that what they mean? Around 10? Like, I don't know, is that 9 and a half or 10 and a half? Around 10? And Jillian comes back into the story, and she's like, okay, Dale, you're talking to this guy, Chris Avery, and he's telling you all this information. Gary Poste was 6 feet tall. He was 200 pounds in 1969. He wore a size 10 shoe. But you're just hearing this from Chris Avery. How do you know that he's telling the truth? And this is what Jillian actually asks Dale Julin. She says, now he's somebody who's been following the Zodiac case for quite a while. Could he not have just searched this stuff on the internet and then just said that Gary Poste met these parameters? And I think that her skepticism is spot on. Now, Dale Julin had a response, and he's saying that Chris and Gary Poste used to trade shoes. They would go out on these hunting trips. They would go out and spend extended periods of time in the woods. Wilderness survival. That's what they were into. And they would trade shoes and trade boots, and they could wear the same size. So I guess Chris is around a size 10. I don't know what that means, but that was his response. And yes, Gary Poste was arrested once for I believe domestic abuse, but for like a domestic disturbance. But in the book, they talk about how he was arrested for vandalism, and more or less, we've gathered that Gary Poste was indeed 6 feet tall. Can I just ask you guys? This is a live stream. What do you think about Gary Poste as a suspect? Do you think that there are strong points that would indicate that he was the Zodiac Killer, or do you think that he is a weaker suspect? Now, as for somebody who was not a close follower of the Zodiac Killer mystery like Dale Julin, he just was really caught off guard by this person, Chris Avery, approaching him and saying that he has a story for him and he knows the identity of the Zodiac Killer. And he more or less took the first suspect that he encountered and he just ran with it. Dale Julin did. He ran with it. He was like, if I just call up somebody out of the blue or something, any TV network that I can get to listen to me, and I say, I know who the Zodiac is, and then they do their own investigation and they agree with it. There are a lot of people out there, and it's almost like Chris Avery put the ball in motion, and then Dale Julin took the ball and ran with it. Then the case breakers took the ball and ran with it. So here's the thing. I've been making episodes about the Zodiac Killer since 2017. I talk about all types of subjects here on this channel, and I'm going to be talking about the Zodiac again on Wednesday, but I'm still doing the Anything Goes Friday segment that has come back. Any subject is fair game, anything under the sun or in the darkness. But I do regularly make episodes about the Zodiac Killer since 2017, 6.5 years. And I get these types of people all the time. I am absolutely not impressed about how Chris Avery is presenting the story, about how he's contacting Dale Julin. And you see the same types of language. He's not just a suspect. He's the guy. It's not a theory. It's the truth. I know who the Zodiac was. Every other suspect is wrong. I've heard it all so many times. And I've said before, about 3 or 4 times a month, I get a new suspect sent to me. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. And somebody tells me that they've solved the Zodiac Killer mystery, and here's their person of interest. I just got one about 4 hours before the start of this recording today. I'm absolutely not impressed by just some guy who's, bear in mind, Chris Avery's just some homeless guy who's making phone calls and running his mouth and doesn't necessarily have his life in order. And to the credit of Dale Julin, firstly, he helps Chris Avery get into a homeless shelter. Then at another time, he finds a place for him to stay, and they try to get him into a shelter again. But Lots of people out there claim that they have solved the Zodiac, and they present cases of almost equal value to everything that Dale Julin has discussed in the book so far. Okay, looking at some possible solutions to the ciphers, looking at some possible solutions to the artwork on the greeting cards, and looking at height and weight and all that. And doesn't mean that the person is eliminated, but it's definitely not very compelling evidence. And Cat Daddy Steve says, by now Poste is off my suspect list. Well, as I said, it's just not very compelling. The Swedish chef says, an absolutely horrible suspect. The evidence isn't extremely strong. And Mikey Bananas is here. Gary Poste is a very poor suspect. And another one from the Swedish chef. So far, there's nothing that would make me want to buy this book or support Julin's work. This is part one. Let's see if there's something in part two for you, Swedish chef. I once did an episode on this channel called Zodiac Killer, looking at the suspect Rodney Hamlin. Okay, I jumped ahead of myself. The episode is called Zodiac Killer Rodney Hamlin, looking at the Zodiac suspect Rodney Hamlin. Rodney Hamlin was the business partner of Gary Francis Poste. They worked with a painting company. Gary Francis Poste was a house painter, more or less. And that's something that Dale Julin talks about in the book as well. He did this for years and years. That was his primary occupation. Yes, he was ex-Air Force, but he was also more well known for being a house painter. And there's a YouTube channel out there called Nancy Drew. I just call it the Nancy Drew channel. It's run by a guy. And he once did an episode talking about Rodney Hamlin as a Zodiac suspect, which is more or less asking the question, what if the case breakers and Dale Julin were going down the right track, but they missed it by just that much, and it was actually his business partner, Rodney Hamlin, and not Gary Poste? And the honest answer is, based on everything that you've heard in this episode, I think that would be impossible. It wouldn't mean that they were going down the right track, because Dale Julin is literally inserting Gary Poste's name into the Zodiac Killer communications and getting these results. Nearly impossible. The only way you could say that that would work is they're going down the right path and they just got the wrong guy by that much. It's practically impossible, because you'd have to say that Rodney Hamlin inserted Gary Poste's name into the Zodiac communications, specifically expecting that somebody like Dale Julin would find it and look for Gary Poste. Implausible. And I have to give a shout out to Neil, who uses the name They Can't All Be Zodiac, when he said that the Nancy Drew channel is mostly just satire. And I think that channel is purely done for entertainment. Now, it started out as making some videos looking at suspects that were unconventional, and I really liked the Zodiac Killer video about John L. Johnson on the Nancy Drew channel, because there was even a line in there when he says that if we're going to look at suspects under the radar, if you think that the Zodiac is a suspect that flew under the radar, you have to look at places that are under the radar or off the grid and look in some different ways. And I'm like, well, hey, bring it on. I do a segment every week talking about the Zodiac and trying to find new leads, new possibilities. I openly said I correspond with people regularly about their suspects and their persons of interest. More power to you. Then the Nancy Drew channel started more or less aligning with the case breaker, saying, okay, Gary Poste was the Zodiac, Gary Francis Poste, he's the guy, case closed, the case has been cracked, the case has been broken. Then he made the Rodney Hamlin video, and he just went on to make kind of more and more bizarre things, and I mostly agree right now that channel's done for satire. I mean, if you just want to follow something that's related to entertainment and so on, and you find some type of entertaining value, more power to you, but for me, that's just not really for me. I mean, that's just not my cup of joe, if you know what I mean. And also, I want to really give you guys the floor and share anything that you would like about Gary Poste as the Zodiac. I've mostly gone through a lot of the events in the book. There is a very, very lengthy interview that is in the book featuring Chris Avery and Dale Julin that's on the record, and that their names are just there, like Dale, like the colon, his words, and then Chris Avery, colon, and these are his words. I really can't say that it was going in a strong direction. And there are also a lot of anecdotes and personal stories in the book. And it's Dale Julin's book. He can write whatever he wants, but they're not Zodiac related. They're just talking about his own personal experiences. And I've more or less accepted that people are going to do that, not only with Zodiac books, but also with just other true crime books. If someone's like, okay, this is my chance to write a book and tell my story, I'm going to insert things about what I had for breakfast and so on. It happens all the time, but my eyes just kind of like skim read those parts and then get back to the facts of the case. And River Prom Pottery says, what would be Gary or Rodney's motive? Okay, River Prom Pottery. Number one, Gary Poste was a sadistic individual. That's why they're telling all these stories about how he attacked bears and deer, raccoons. Chris Avery says Gary Poste would kill anything. And I think sometimes he did harvest the meat, I think. But it seems like the primary motive was just to kill the animals. And he was a sadistic individual. That's one. And almost just like that, hunting people for sport. Now, there is another point, though. Brian Hardgrave says, is there something new about Poste? Just the release of Dale Julin's book, Catching Zodiac. And I'll come back to that point in a second, I promise. But it's my understanding that Dale Julin actually finished this book back in 2021. And I cite an article from the Tahoe Daily Tribune that talked about how Dale Julin has written his book and he was ready to release it back in 2021. It just took a rather long time for him to get the book out. But here's something else. You guys might remember from the Case Breakers' original coverage of their story in 2021, Gary Poste was the Zodiac, and he buried the guns that were used in the crimes. This is big. If this were true hypothetically, that's evidence that could solve the case. That's not just someone's interpretive statement about the 340 and the Halloween card. Anybody can say anything about those. However, if they actually find the guns that were buried, I would accept the result, absolutely. But Chris Avery is the guy who has brought Gary Poste to Dale Julin's attention. And he's saying he owned the same type of guns that were used in the Zodiac crimes. We're talking about things like a 22, things like a 9mm, 45 that was carried at Lake Berryessa. Possibly. We don't necessarily know 100% what type of gun it was. Brian Hartnell, the surviving victim at Lake Berryessa, just was shown some images of guns and he recognized it as a 45, but the victims at Lake Berryessa were stabbed. Now, what I believe it's the person from the FBI that's Dale Julin is discussing this with, who just says, your suspect owned these guns? Well, and that's all the information that you have. Lots of people can own a 22 caliber firearm or a 9mm. That's also not very impressive. And what I don't get is, why is Dale Julin just telling all of these stories about how he shows people his evidence and they're like, really, dude? Is that it? That's more or less the response. Yet maybe he's just going in complete linear fashion, telling everybody everything that he did with exploring the Zodiac killer mystery. But also, in Dale Julin's defense, I told you he told that story 3 times about asking people to find Gary Poste's name in the Halloween card. Some people are very impressed by that. They're like, what am I doing? What am I looking for? Yeah, Gary. Oh my God, Dale, you're onto something. I'm not impressed by it, but... And Cat Daddy Steve says, no guns, no case. If Chris Avery knows so much about this, well, where are the guns buried? If there's a story that Gary Francis Poste was the Zodiac killer and he buried the guns, where are they? The Case Breakers also released a possible interpretation of the Halloween cards artwork, which was supposed to reveal the location of Donnas Lass's burial. And Dale Julin's Zodiac theory is heavily centered on Donnas Lass. I've even praised him in the past for trying to discuss Donnas Lass more. And one thing that I didn't quite understand was why. Well, think about Dale Julin's research process. He learned about the Zodiac case. He got on ZodiacKiller.com. He's looking at the list of Zodiac communications. The one that stood out to him the most was the Halloween card. And he also wanted to know, he says all this in the book, mind you, what could have prompted the Zodiac killer to create the Halloween card? Were there any possible Zodiac crimes that occurred on or around October 27th of 1970. On October 27th, I can't think of one. October 25th or 6th. That was the murder of Nancy Benelak, right? But now the perpetrator in that crime has been identified. One crime that he did look at was on September 6th of 1970, the disappearance of Donnas Lass. So he's thinking that could the Zodiac some way, somehow be trying to communicate a message about the disappearance of Donnas Lass in the Halloween card? And that's what prompted him to center his research method and research process around Donnas Lass. The problem is, though, he thought that the Halloween card's artwork was supposed to reveal a solution that says 4 miles east of State Line, Nevada, and Donnas Lass was found on the west side. Not she wasn't found on the east side of Lake Tahoe going into Nevada. She was found on the west side of Lake Tahoe going into California, in Placer County, California. So not only was he incorrect, he was going in the absolute wrong direction with that. Now, I haven't got to that point in the book yet when he's going to show us how he interprets all of the greeting card artwork. But that's one of the reasons why he has focused his theory on Donnas Lass. And to his credit, we have these elements of curiosity. But think about everything that I've told you so far. Somebody presents him with this suspect. He goes with it. He makes some observations about the case, and he goes with it. Well, could this be something that's tied into my next observation about the case? And he goes with it. He's just going from A to B to C to D, all on his own. And what it doesn't appear that he's doing is backtracking, taking a step back, and just saying, could I be wrong about this? Jillian does that. Mr. Dodd does that. They call him out all the time. And what I'm not hearing is reflection, self-evaluation, being aware that you could be mistaken. It's just trying to make the narrative fit. And Jeannie says, these people were just convinced that Gary Francis Poste was absolutely the Zodiac. Yeah, more or less. They have now. It's possible that Tom Colbert from the Case Breakers is an absolute fraud and that he just genuinely spreads lies and misinformation. I've always said that I haven't seen anything fraudulent from Dale Julin. And in the book, he tells you his research method. He tells you what he's doing. He seems like a guy who is a genuine Zodiac sleuth. He spent at least 7 years writing this book, maybe even more, during the edits and rewrites process. I think he's honest, just mistaken. Irish Brummy says the Case Breakers are the piss takers. Mostly. And what the Swedish chef says is, what I don't get is why would Dale Julin publish a book like this if he wants to be seen as a serious researcher? I think it's something that I've kind of like laid out in that most recent set of rambling that I just did. He made some observations about the case, and he didn't want to back down. Countless people do this in these true crime cases. And the Swedish chef is right. Sometimes you have to admit that you're wrong. I have done this so many times. If you go back through the old episodes of Black Box Online Radio, you'll hear me saying some very different stuff back in 2019 about the Zodiac killer mystery. And then you begin to realize that, all right, I jumped into that theory prematurely. I was just saying, oh, there are all of these psychological markers that indicate multiple killers. Maybe? I'm far less convinced of that because, well, I don't know, and you could just as easily interpret the evidence that a single perpetrator was responsible for the crimes. And I don't think everybody does that, where they just have those moments when they're like, I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. I even did this recently when I did this episode about the meaning of the Zodiac killer's symbol. And I was like reading up on all these things about Kronos and Anankis and how the Zodiac symbol is the Cyclos and the Kuklos, and it's from Greek mythology, and the Zodiac killer is trying to play the part of Kronos, and all of the elements in the Zodiac killer mystery have symbolic meanings that are tied to Greek mythology. Then I was like, okay, I came down from that cloud. Now I'm thinking maybe some of that is true, but what other people would do is they might just stay up there and be like, no, that's it because it makes sense to me. I've been wrong so many times, it doesn't bother me at this point. And also, as I just said, like, I got ahead of myself and maybe I was pattern seeking to get a desired result. And instead of just being absolutely certain about something, it just goes into another basket called possibilities. Let's see how far this goes. Cat Daddy Steve says 1977 mental and emotional health issues such as bipolar. Cat Daddy Steve, are you referring to Gary Poste, and you're saying that Gary Poste was bipolar? Now, it's quite possible the Zodiac was dealing with something like that. I've said very clearly that I don't believe the Zodiac was a schizophrenic. With something like bipolar disorder, he might have had more control of his mental faculties, and people respond to bipolar disorder in very different ways. So I can't necessarily say that everyone with bipolar disorder is going to behave the same way. Also, schizophrenia is the same, though. There are high functioning schizophrenics, and then there are very low functioning schizophrenics. Midnight Ventures is here. Hello, Midnight Ventures. Welcome to part one of the book discussion on Catching Zodiac by Dale Julin. And Irish Brummy says in the interview with the experts series, there are 20 experts with 20 theories. Statistically, at least 95% of them are wrong. Yeah. It's quite possible that 100% of the people on the experts series are wrong about that. Because we have to understand, these are interpretations of the evidence. These are when people are looking at this unknown question and they're trying to see how this could be put into place. But sometimes they do get the right answer. David Ornchak and the guys solved the 340, and the computer did some of the work, but most likely that's the correct solution. Don and Betty Hardin didn't even use a computer to solve the 408 cipher. That was most likely the correct solution. I believe that that's correct as well. There are certain parts of the story that we can learn to be true. Now, some people came very close to identifying the location of Donnas Lass, and one of them is Sphere the Cube. That's his online name. I call him Sphery. And, his math wasn't exactly perfect, but it was pretty close to identifying the burial site of Donnas Lass, or where Donnas Lass's remains would have been found. And she was, most likely dismembered at some point, possibly even done because of the elements and by wildlife. So Sphery was much closer than Dale Julin was. Cat Daddy Steve says, Ray Grant and Manny Grossman are both very intelligent, yet crazy. I don't necessarily think Manny Grossman is crazy. Manny hasn't done anything to me that has showed that he is crazy. And Ray Grant isn't exactly crazy either. He just would be another person who got hooked on his theory very early on and didn't have that come down moment that other people have. And they're like, all right. I got a little bit ahead of myself. Now I need to kind of just reevaluate things. Because he's had mostly the same Zodiac theory since 1990, the partnership theory. And River Prom Pottery says, do you think this Gary Poste story is more of a money grab rather than a real attempt at solving? I absolutely do not think that Dale Julin is trying to do any type of money grab. I don't think that Dale Julin is trying to exploit the case or anything. The case breakers, and Tom Colbert specifically, perhaps. I thought that from the beginning. But with Dale Julin, he seems like somebody who was just presented with these findings, and then he decided to keep seeing how far he could go with this idea. But that really is not the best research method. Okay, now we're approaching the 50-minute mark, and I just want to say thank you so much for listening to this book discussion on Catching Zodiac by Dale Julin. And again, this was not a traditional book review. This is in the book discussions that I do on this channel, I just pull out some ideas from the book. And this one will focus on the early parts of the book, and the next book discussion is going to focus on the ending parts of the book. And I'm also going to be responding to more questions and comments, because Wednesday is the day that is reserved for the AMA. And one final announcement is that I am releasing the audiobook version of Down the Dark Lane, something that was written by me, 3 thrillers from the Motel, and that comes out on the weekends. And I've released the most recent segment, and it is it is on the playlist for Down the Dark Lane. And the first story in Down the Dark Lane was called The Open Road Shall Decide. And that came out 95% the way that I wanted it to. Not perfectly, 95% though. With the second story, Green Green Charlie, it's not exactly coming out the way that I wanted, but I'm going to keep trying. No stopping now, right? Please feel free to check out the audiobook episodes on the weekend. Tune in for the Anything Goes Friday segment. And one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. If you're listening to this at a future date, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. And Cat Daddy Steve says, thanks for streaming USA time, Ned. Oh, of course. Zodiac Monday normally comes out in the morning. Over the years, though, Zodiac Monday has come out at like 12:01 a.m., 9 p.m. Trying my best, guys, but I really wanted to focus this one. And River Prom Pottery says, I love this format. Love the idea. Oh, yeah, there'll be some more of these coming out, doing the book discussions as well as some of the older ones, because sometimes you really do need the images on the screen. And if you're listening to this in a future date, I want to know, what do you think about Gary Francis Poste as a Zodiac killer suspect? Share anything that you want. And as for me now, I'm going to sign off, and I will see you on the Wednesday show to continue the book discussion on Catching Zodiac by Dale Julin. And goodbye.